this week I wanted to follow up on last week and do another practical rhetoric lecture, this time on just some small stuff. So like I said last week, I think rhetoric is, like scansion, is an intimidating word. I think it turns a lot of people off. I think we think of it as something intellectual and not practical or applicable. And that's not true, although our schooling system has indeed made that true for many people. So last week, we talked about antithesis, which I will again say I think is the most important thing if we're talking about rhetoric in Shakespeare. It's just, he uses it the most. It is almost always a guide to your operative stresses, to your words, to shaping a speech. We talked about alliteration. More importantly, we talked about repetitive sounds, often consonants, but also vowels, and how they can guide you and how I think you should lean into them. And we talked about irony, which is so difficult to define and difficult in our culture to understand often. I think we find it hard to even find it in the text sometimes. Not that it's hard to see once you know it's there, but because part of the surface definition is that it's playing the opposite, it's hard to spot sometimes. So those three, I thought, needed a nice long chunk to discuss. The stuff I want to talk about tonight are little, they're not little in terms of there are people that devote their lives to rhetoric, but they're little in terms of I think I can talk about them, I think I can give you some small practicalities for them, and then I think we can move on. So they're sort of, so tonight I want to check some boxes. I want to keep adding tools to your toolboxes. So in the metaphor, the big tools were last week: alliteration, antithesis, and irony. Those are big tools. They're in every scene. You'll find them everywhere. You can always apply them. Tonight are smaller tools. I think they'll be helpful for you to know, and you probably know many of them, and I'm just going to talk about the practical use of some of them with some examples. So the first thing I want to talk about are malapropisms. That is the unintentional use of the wrong word. It's used for comedy. I'm going to say exclusively. Maybe somebody could find me an example where that's not the case. Now, not the speaker. The speaker is not aware of the malapropism. That's part of it. But in the context of the play and the drama of it or the comedy of it, it is for comedy. Usually a malapropism has a similar sound to the word it's replacing. So if, you know, Dogberry is the most famous use of malapropisms in the canon, I think, in Much Ado. He has one wonderful line to Leonato where he says, "Our watch, sir, have indeed comprehended two auspicious persons." So comprehended, which actually means to understand instead of taking them, and auspicious instead of suspicious, or comprehending. And again, it's the use is in comedy, and Dogberry is a key example. So for malapropisms, I think you need to lean into it. I think you need to lean into the wrong word. So indeed, comprehended two auspicious persons. The speaker needs to relish in the word. You do need to serve it up to the audience a bit, especially because some malapropisms are a bit archaic now. So if you want to pluck them out for the audience, you need to help the audience a bit. So you're lifting the malaprop, often coining it as if it's a word you've invented or a rarely used word that you're showing off with, and it's funnier because you get it wrong. So yeah, you need to help the audience's ear in catching it. So those are malapropisms. Similarly, we have onomatopoeia, which I addressed in Scansion weeks ago, and Will spelled out for us. Will, if you feel like doing it again, please do. But they are words that imitate natural sounds. So I'm putting them together because onomatopoeia similarly needs to be leaned into. There is no subtlety in it. If you play it subtly, you lose the effect of it. It doesn't exist. So some good examples are from Henry VIII. There be more wasps that buzz about his nose. From Winter's Tale, whose issue will hiss me to my grave. And perhaps most famously from Midsummer, Bottom singing and dares not answer nay. So this is where the word itself imitates its sound. I think you need to lean into it, play it up, serve it up to the audience. If you feel like you're gilding the lily too much, you can talk to a director about it, see what it is. But if you don't lean into it, it doesn't exist. It can't if you don't frame it for the audience. So that is malapropisms, that is onomatopoeia. The next and maybe the longest of these smaller examples is parenthesis. So what we're talking about here is separating a word or phrase. It's a word or phrase that interrupts the syntactic flow. So the argument is A, B, and C, but between B and C, Shakespeare gives you a nice chunk of time saying something else. So you have to hunt for parenthesis because editors rarely give it to you. That's not always true. There are times where you'll literally see the parentheses in the work, but it's not nearly set up as often as you'll find it. Sometimes there are long dashes will separate them. When I address these, I'm often trying to tie the argument together without the parenthesis. So if the argument is this, if we take the parenthesis out, the argument still connects. We're still going from one point to another. The parenthesis is a run-on, or it's a scramble, or a character is struggling either to confine their ideas or they need to make another point. Parenthesis is one of the most naturalistic rhetorical devices that Shakespeare uses. And my example for this will be a wonderful Hotspur one, which is like about 8 lines of parenthesis that I will get to. And they demand a tonal shift. So you have to vocally set the parenthetical aside from the main argument. So if you're going A, B, parenthesis, D, A, B, parenthesis, C, it's A, B, parenthesis, C. So the most common parenthesis, or the most obvious parenthesis, are asides. So anytime a character sort of turns out to the audience to make a comment, you can think of that as a parenthesis, right? It's outside of the line of the play or the argument, although it's often commenting on those things, but it demands a vocal shift. Otherwise, it becomes a muddle. And when listening to an actor speaking through an argument, one of the major reasons it can get muddled and lost, outside of overemphasizing, which I think is villain number 1, is when parentheticals enter the argument and they don't separate them enough. They don't help the audience's ear follow the fact that we're actually breaking off from the argument. And they're often long, so you gotta keep them tight. When you have a parenthetical, you gotta keep it together. They're sometimes rambling, there's sometimes thoughts getting away, etc. They're outside of the direct argument, but often commenting on it. Tangents and asides are sort of the extreme example. So I'm going to just glance at a piece of Hotspur here. Let me find it. So this is Hotspur being encouraged to lead a rebellion by his uncle and father. Not just encouraged, but also sort of manipulated into doing it. But he's, and he's furious with the king. And he says, this is Act 1, Scene 3. I'm just going to read it. I don't think we need to look at it. But he says, "Why, look you, I am whipped and scourged with rods, nettled and stung with pismires when I hear of this vile politician, Bolingbroke. In Richard's time," what do you call the place? "A plague on it. It is in Gloucestershire. 'Twas where the madcap duke his uncle kept. His uncle York. Where first I bowed my knee unto the king of smiles, this Bolingbroke. Splot, when you and he were back at Ravenspur." Northumberland says, "At Berkeley Castle. You say true. Why, what a candle deal of courtesy this fawning greyhound then did proffer me." So the argument is, in Richard's time, at Berkeley Castle, what a candy deal of courtesy this fawning greyhound then did proffer me. And Hotspur gets lost, as he often does, on this wonderful tangent of not remembering the name of the place. In this sense, it's used for comedy. It's not always used for comedy. In Hotspur's case, it often is. But it's where the argument essentially goes off the rails. And so that is parenthesis. You need to vocally distinguish it, and you need to keep it together. And sometimes you will have to vocally connect an argument from one line and then you have a parenthesis that can go 8 or 10 lines, and you have to vocally bring the audience back to the original argument. So it takes work. I mean, sometimes it's hard, but that's the job, or that is what we're attempting to do. So that's parenthesis. I'll brief. So again, now we're getting into things that I'm sure all of you know. I'm going to address them for practical reasons. So a simile is a comparison between two things using either like or as. So something is as something or like something. From Sonnet 68, my love is as a fever, longing still for that which longer nurseth the disease. And the key, what I want to address practically in similes, is that you want to coin the simile. You want to discover it. It's much more interesting than this comes to our poetry discussion. It's much more interesting than a recital. So my love is as a disease, or as a fever, sorry. My love is as a fever, longing still for that which longer nurseth the disease. So by discovering it, it's more exciting, it's more dramatic, instead of just a recitation. So when you have a simile, discover the as, discover the second half of it, and that'll continue leading to discoveries. Similar, we have metaphor, which is the comparison between two unlike things achieved through figurative words. So now is the winter of our discontent, made glorious summer by this son of York. And all the clouds that lowered upon our house in the deep bosom of the ocean buried. The key is keeping it together, and don't let the argument get lost in the poetry, which I might have just done, because I'm gonna give it to you again. Coining and discovery, like simile, are important. But more important with metaphors, because sometimes they go on so long, and because they're almost always poetic by their very nature, is not losing the argument in the poetry of it. So now is the winter of our discontent made glorious summer by this son of York. So this, it's interesting. It's such a famous line that even I lose it sometimes. The winter of our discontent is the end of our discontent, made glorious summer by this son of York, his brother, King Edward. I think we often just hear winter and summer. We can get lost in the poetry. So now is the winter of our discontent, made glorious summer by this son of York. And all the clouds that lowered upon our house in the deep bosom of the ocean buried. And if you want a good, a nerdy scansion argument, you can go down the rabbit hole of scholars arguing whether it's buried or buried. People have some strong opinions about it. On a side note, I'm going to bring up, I had to do research on this. I think I'm right about this. I think it's called a polyseme, which is a word. So son of York. Son means two things in this phrase. It means both the son of the house of York, Edward. It also is the son to the metaphor. Now is the winter of our discontent, made glorious summer by this son. I bring this up as a side note because I don't think you can play it. You will find it in Shakespeare. I have tried to lean into it. I have tried in my own way to find ways of playing it cleverly and showing the audience that I get that there are 2 or 3 meanings here. I don't think you can. If you lean into it too much, it sounds silly. I think it's one of those things where people on the out there in the audience, people that know it, might enjoy it. I don't know if in playing you can do much with it. But it is nice to know it's there. So repetition, the repeated use of a word or phrase to give it emphasis. In practical terms, I think there are 2 kinds of repetition. We have a sort of intentional repetition, where we are intentionally repeating the same word or phrase for emphasis. So with that emphasis, we do need to emphasize it. Differently, we need to color it, but but Brutus says he was ambitious, and Brutus is an honorable man, and Brutus is an honorable man. You know, you can't throw that away. That repeated phrase has to continue receiving a building emphasis. And then there's, I'm going to say unintentional. That doesn't mean the characters aren't intending to bring up the word, but unintentional in terms of all the other words around it are really the point. And so we just did some wonderful work on All's Well That Ends Well in a scene where mother is said like 30 times. Probably not literally, but maybe 15 or 20 times. You only really want to emphasize mother 1 or 2 times. You got to pick your battles. Otherwise, all the adjusting words around mother, because mother is not being repeated intentionally in terms of making a point about it, but the argument is circling it. So all the circling words that balance mother need to take building emphasis. I think the second is more common. I think choosing to emphasize a repeated word over and over, or a repeated phrase over and over, is less common. The real point of the second one, of not repeating the same word over and over unless there's a real point to it, is this is about our first lecture. This is about operative stress. This is about keeping the audience's ear. If they already have the information, why am I re-emphasizing it? What they need is the adjusted information. They need the building information. So you want to be emphasizing the words around it. I'll also note, this is a good rule to try to understand on rhyming, where there are rhymes where you have to hit the rhyming word, where it's obvious that that's the target word and you got to do it. So this is interpretive. When you can emphasize off the rhyme, it's more effective, because emphasizing off the rhyme stops you from getting into sort of a sing-song rhythm. And it's actually easier to follow the rhyme if you're not hitting the rhyme. Now, again, there are times when you have to hit the rhyme, but in a similar way, this isn't repetition, but in a similar way, if you can, back off the repetition of the rhyme, or not the repetition, back off the emphasis of the rhyme in the same way you're backing off the emphasis of the repeated word or phrase. And then the last thing I want to mention is lists, which lists are hard in a technical way, because the difficulty is differentiating each piece of the list without slowing down to do it. Now, that doesn't mean you can't take your time with some lists. That doesn't mean you can't find pace with some lists. But the key is you don't want to slow down to be taking pauses between each word so that you can fresh coin it and make it interesting. That'll get very long and boring. So lists need to move. And within the context of that, you are still trying to make each word individual. So how do you do it? It's choice and point of view, and this is craft. You need to build the list. So I would encourage you in rehearsal or on your own to move very slowly and have a point of view about each word, shape them. And then once you've shaped them with your artistic palette, slowly start ramping up the speed. That's it. So practical rhetoric, small stuff. The big stuff I brought up last time, those are the big ones. These are small ones. They're tools in your toolkit. By taking advantage of them, I think you'll milk more out of the text. The more you know, the better. But I brought these up as practicalities. I want to banish the idea of rhetoric or scansion as intellectual exercises that are wasted. And the problem is that in many education systems, they are. But they are active tools you can use to be better. So there's some small stuff to help you with.